Hello everyone and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Public Information Officer of APA's Northern New England chapter and one of the coordinators of the Planning Webcast series. This series is brought to you by a consortium of over 40 of APA's chapters and divisions. The consortium itself is not affiliated with APA but rather is a loose-knit association whose mission is to provide high-quality free webinars on topics important to planners that will also help them meet their certification maintenance requirements. Today, Friday, November 4th, 2016, we'll hear the presentation, Nurturing Creative Places, a dive into the Arts and Planning Toolkit. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box or question box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen or call the 1-800 number shown for truly difficult technical questions that I can't help you with. For content-related questions related to the presentation, type those at any time during the presentation into the question box located on the webinar toolbar on the right of your screen. We'll answer those at the end of the presentation during Q&A. Here's a list of sponsoring chapters and division, and I want to thank all of them for their support for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is brought to you by the Massachusetts chapter of APA. Thank you, Massachusetts. And here's a list of a couple of upcoming webcasts. Note that we are winding down the end of the year. It looks like both the November 18th and December 2nd webcasts will not happen. We are working on the December 9th webcast. We do have the December 16th webcast set to go. We're also scheduling 2017 webcasts. So if you have an idea for a great webcast, get in touch with me at bfrost@nhhfa.org. To log your CM credits, log into your APA account and you can search under the CM log, search for CM activities. In the search bar, type the event number, which is 9112776, or the title of today's webcast, Nurturing Creative Places. You can like us on Facebook and get the most up-to-date information. We're recording today's webcast, and so you can look for the recording on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/planningwebcast, and PDFs of today's presentations will be available on the ohioplanning.org website. Today's speakers are Jennifer Erickson and Julie Burrows. Jennifer is the Manager of Technical Assistance Programs at the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission in Boston, and Julie Burrows is the Chief of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston, and I think the two of them are probably in competition for the coolest jobs in the world. And let me hand it over to them. Julie, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Ben. Hi, everyone out there in APA land. This is Julie Burrows. I'm the Chief of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston. I am a planner by training, and so have this career of melding the tools of urban planning to help arts and culture in a city thrive. I'm fairly new to Boston. I've been here for 2 years, and prior to that I was with the City of Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events for about 15 years, and prior to that I was a downtown planner for the City of Chicago Department of Planning and Development. And I think Jen is going to go ahead and self-introduce herself as well.
So my name is Jen Erickson. I'm a regional planner and I manage the technical assistance programs at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in Boston. My background is actually in the arts. So before I became a planner, I worked for nonprofit arts organizations, and I also worked for foundations that funded projects in arts and culture. At MAPC, I work in the land use division, and I help staff a lot of different types of planning projects that are both interdisciplinary and topical. I've also helped to found the new APA Arts and Planning Interest Group, so I'll have a slide with some information on how you can get involved with that. So to start us off, thank you for joining us for the next hour and a half. The goal of this session is to dive into a project that Julie and I have been working on over the last year, which is to create an Arts and Planning Toolkit that's for an audience of planners. Here is our contact information, just so you can take a quick glance in case you have questions after the webinar, and we'll show that again at the end. So here is some information about the APA Arts and Planning Interest Group. Julie is a member of that group as well, and we have almost 200 members at this point. We formed at the Phoenix conference back in April of this year. Ben is also a member of our interest group, and we hope you'll join us and continue the conversation after today's webinar. So here are our goals for the next hour and a half. We would like to show you a new framework for engaging with arts and culture and finding ways to integrate it into the disciplines of planning in which you work. We will also dive into several case studies of real projects that are infusing creativity into civic life and into the physical and social environments of communities. And we also want to present you with a range of resources that are available to support you as you continue to explore how arts and culture can add value to your planning practice. So Julie and I believe that arts and culture is an essential element of livability, and it's really an important piece of what makes places and communities healthy, connected, and vibrant. Through arts and culture, people from different walks of life have unique opportunities to socialize, learn, and play. They have unique and exciting opportunities to understand and interact with the built and natural environment. And people also have opportunities to engage with elements in their individual and in their community's past, present, and future. So as planners, we're in the business of leading the redevelopment and implementation of plans and policies that create livable communities. And we're really well positioned to create conditions that allow arts and culture and creativity to thrive, and to infuse creativity into our practice in ways that accelerate things we care about, like equity, vitality, and livability. So MAPC, my organization, we are a regional planning agency, and we have what we call the Metro Future Regional Plan. And in Metro Future, we have arts and culture goals and priorities. And those include ensuring that more people take advantage of the region's artistic and cultural resources. And we have specific planning objectives, including fostering urban vitality through support for arts districts, supporting arts and culture as a way to build community and civic engagement, supporting the coordination of creative economy initiatives, and supporting live workspaces and creative incubator spaces. So we do believe that arts and culture is a core competency for planners, but as a planning agency, we've never done a project that really put our arts and culture goals and priorities front and center. So last year, I started talking with a cohort of the planners that I regularly work with in our MAPC region about creating an arts and planning toolkit. So the toolkit aims to accomplish several things: to create a framework that really links together all the different disciplines of arts and culture and all the different ways they can accelerate the advancement of a range of planning objectives beyond the readily embraced disciplines of economic development, architecture, and design. And we also wanted to create a tool that was grounded in case studies that would showcase a range of planning and policy tools and approaches that are already in play, and to ground that research in primary and secondary information. So we did over 25 interviews with planners and arts professionals in and outside of the MAPC region and other parts of the country to develop case studies, and we also synthesized information from peer-reviewed academic and professional resources. So here's a preview of the Arts and Planning Toolkit. It's actually live now as a website that you can visit at artsandplanning.org. The website is continually being expanded with additional content. So after this webinar, you can dive into it to dig into some of the detailed content pages, but in this webinar, I'll talk about how we got to this point of developing the toolkit and dive much deeper into each of the case studies, including some that may not yet have been posted to the website. So as I mentioned earlier, about a year and a half ago, I started a conversation with our region of planners that we work with about the value of having this type of project. So we formed a working group of 12 municipalities along with advisors from state and regional organizations to develop the toolkit. We also had consultation conversations with the National Endowment for the Arts, the Americans for the Arts, and Art Place America, some of the institutions that are funding a lot of creative placemaking and cultural planning work in the country. And they advised us on people that we could think about interviewing for the toolkit, as well as resources we should be sure to link to. So the framework of the toolkit is one that's grounded in the case studies that we've done, and there are 5 sections of content that I'll dive into. But first I'll say the toolkit really knits together a lot of content that's already out there but isn't necessarily written to resonate to a planner or government audience. The goal in the spirit of the toolkit is to say that planning can be participatory and dynamic and inspired, and arts and culture can help us get better and do that work. It would inject a lot of fun into our profession, and the toolkit really aims to be an accessible primer and source of inspiration. So the toolkit is grounded in 5 types of content, and I'll talk about each one. The grouping is really based on our personal assessment of the kinds of information and tools and resources we were finding, and this seemed to us to be the most logical way to group the content. So the Arts, Culture, and Planning section reviews creative tools employed by people working in a variety of sectors to infuse creativity into planning processes at the neighborhood, city, town, and regional scales. Under this section, you can learn about creative placemaking, tactical urbanism, cultural planning, cultural asset mapping, and more. Under the Art and Infrastructure section, we review public art policies and programs that facilitate the production and integration of arts and culture and creativity in the public realm and in public infrastructure. You can learn about opportunities to promote the integration of temporary and permanent public art into the planning, design, development, and preservation of places. Under the Art and Zoning and Permitting section, we review regulatory considerations pertaining to the production of temporary or permanent public art in its varied forms, as well as arts uses and facilities, including artist housing, artist live workspace, and regulation of artist manufacturing production space. It's basically a primer for planners to consider how they can ensure that zoning and permitting processes are friendly to arts and cultural uses and activities. The Arts, Culture, and Economic Development section reviews local, municipal, and regional approaches to promoting cultural economic development. Under the section, you can learn about programs and initiatives involving the government, nonprofit, and private sectors that are focused on attracting and supporting the growth and sustainability of the creative economy, including creative industries. And under the Arts Funding section, we review the landscape of state, federal, and philanthropic funding for arts and culture in the U.S. There you can learn about current funding programs, particularly those administered by various government agencies. And in that section, we do focus some of the language on the Massachusetts context, since our toolkit is really geared towards Massachusetts. So this page is a preview of what you might find if you were to click any of the 5 higher level sections. So under Arts and Culture and Planning, this is a preview of the types of posts of content that you would find. So if you were to click any of these read more links, you would see a deeper dive describing each of these practice areas. And this page is an example of what you would see if you were to click, for example, creative placemaking, which is nested under Arts, Culture, and Planning. You would see links to case studies that we've written on creative placemaking initiatives and projects, and you'd also view a page of additional information explaining what the practice is and some tips for people who are thinking of kicking off a creative placemaking project as an element of their planning work. Each page of content in the toolkit is grounded in research, so at the bottom of each page you'll see something like this where it lists sources for additional reading. For example, creative placemaking has been written about in earnest since 2010, and these are some of the most important resources that you could take a look at to really become versed in this topic area. So the next several slides I'll be talking about a handful of case studies in the toolkit to give you a sense of the type of content you'll find. Creative placemaking and the environment. This is a slide about the Fargo project in Fargo, North Dakota. And this project was funded through the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as a number of other foundations. This was identified as one of the strongest creative placemaking projects the NEA has ever funded. And in developing this case study for the toolkit, I interviewed planner and landscape architect Nicole Crutchfield. And she told me about the process to develop this project and to raise the resources for it. So I'll step back a little bit to dive into this one. So the City of Fargo partnered with ecological artist Jackie Bruckner to integrate cultural and civic art elements into a stormwater drainage basin installation project. The city is located in the Red River Valley. It has very flat geography, which makes city infrastructure and public and private property susceptible to flooding. They had plans to install 20 drainage basins that would take up a lot of land in urban neighborhoods, and the city sought a creative way to install these basins in a way that would activate these areas as community assets and neighborhood commons. Back in 2010, they kicked off a comprehensive plan update, and one of the community priorities identified was public art and infrastructure improvements to address flooding issues. So within that year, a resident reached out to the city administrator to suggest partnering with Jackie Bruckner as an artist to help to steward that process. So through a series of local presentations and discussions that were really planned by Nicole Crutchfield, the city decided to enter into a partnership with her, and they applied for the grant in 2011 to do a pilot demonstration design process and creative placemaking process at Rabanus Park, which is an 18-acre stormwater detention basin. The project has resulted in many positive changes for the city, including an increase in municipal staff competencies with creative approaches to conducting and implementing planning and infrastructure projects. Before this project, the city had limited experience with integrating art into public facilities projects, such as focusing on parking garages and bus depots. This project enabled attention to the aesthetic and social impact of infrastructure projects. When the basins were first installed, primary attention was devoted to infrastructure design, with little paid to the impact they would have on neighborhoods, which included a significant immigrant refugee population and low-income households. The artists' engagement really created the space to really consider equity and diversity concerns front and center. Artists use creative means to engage diverse populations in understanding the environmental issues and to participate in the actual design of the park that was located in the basin. So here's an example of an arts and planning and creative community engagement type project. The City of St. Paul, Minnesota has operated a city artist residency program since 2005, which places artists in residencies within different departments in government. Public Art St. Paul really operates a city art program as a way to infuse arts and culture into the systems of the city. So through their residency, they help fund the placement of an artist in government to integrate arts and creativities into the daily workings. This particular project was called Pop-Up Meeting. You can see that it's basically a municipal truck that they revamped to be sort of a traveling ice cream truck. And this was the brainchild of artist Amanda Lovely, who's a city artist in residence there. And the goal of the truck was to engage St. Paul's different neighborhoods in their urban planning process. So in exchange for letters and information provided by community members, participants received these locally made St. Pop's Ice Pops from the truck. The project is a playful mechanism for community engagement, bridging the city and people and creatively inviting residents into community conversations. This particular approach has actually been replicated in some other places, likely inspired by Amanda's work. And she's talked a lot about her long-term work with the city. So art and infrastructure, another example from St. Paul, Minnesota, also through the City Art program, City Artist program, artist Marcus Young was placed to work with the Department of Public Works to implement this project, which he described as, streetscapes being the connective tissue of cities, and that their design, development, and maintenance is a fundamental role of city engineering. Streetscapes offer opportunities for art to elevate communities one block and neighborhood at a time. So this project inserted public art into the street infrastructure through a quiet and systemic transformation. The city was undertaking a plan to install rain gardens, and the project wove public art into the system of rain gardens, creating a more artful public realm. Here's an example of a project integrating art and water infrastructure, and this is in Snohomish County, Washington. The Brightwater Wastewater Treatment Plant project started up back in 1999, and it was really at the openness of the current Design and Mitigation Manager, Michael Poponi, in the Department of Natural Resources and Parks, who was very supportive of integrating public art into the design of a new regional wastewater treatment system. So this system now integrates landscape, architecture, wildlife habitat, engineering, art, and education. They worked with For Culture, which is the county's public art authority, to facilitate a peer panel review process to select an artist that they would work with. For Culture managed a public art advisory committee to select a team of artists that would work with the Department of Natural Resources and Parks to implement and integrate art into the project. One of the things the artist team did was create an art master plan to identify Brightwater as an opportunity for artists to develop sensory reminders of our region's ethic of environmental stewardship and sustainability. The art master plan identified thematic zones for integrated artwork that guided the creation of permanent and temporary artworks throughout the 70-acre area of the wastewater treatment plant, often sited in the public open space in the vicinity of the facility and also inside. They commissioned 11 artists to do temporary and permanent interpretive and conceptual projects and guided the inclusion of temporary events that were organized within the Brightwater Center, which was a local education center created to accompany the wastewater treatment plant. Here's a case example of an active arts district that's really supporting community and economic development in the Baltimore area of Maryland. Station North Arts District is a nonprofit that works in close partnership with area educational nonprofit organizations, including the Central Baltimore Partnership, which includes the city and planning and mayor's office and neighborhood associations. As an arts district, they've commissioned public art, have operated festivals, film screenings, and programming that activates public spaces and also underutilized spaces and parcels. They work with diverse arts groups to organize these projects. Sometimes they curate projects themselves, and sometimes they work with teams of local artists and groups to curate activities. So some of the successes of their work in Baltimore include working with the Department of Transportation on art installations, including street furniture. They've done something called the Why Not Lot, which is actually pictured here, which is programming that integrates food trucks, art installations, and performances. They've also worked with the planning department on a zoning code rewrite to include a definition of artist live work and permitting arts, public art, and light industrial areas. I'll note that the former executive director of Station North was also a planner by training, and he believes strongly that there's a space to build knowledge in the field of planning about the benefits of arts and culture to our disciplines of work, and vice versa, for artists to learn the language of planning and find ways to align their initiatives and hopes and interests with our planning work that we do. So here's another case example about art and zoning. Nashville, Tennessee is home to the greatest concentration of songwriters in the United States, and they have an established cultural heritage and history. Metro Arts is the arts and cultural division of Nashville and Davidson County, Tennessee. Their art is largely funded through the city's general operating fund, 0% for Art program. The commission also secures federal and private grants. So Metro Arts has partnered with the county in the past on planning initiatives. They were asked to facilitate the community process to develop an arts, culture, and creativity section of the Nashville Next Comp Plan. The planning process generated many arts and culture planning priorities, including a policy goal to create or streamline land use, zoning, and permitting tools to encourage the creation and enhancement of creative neighborhoods and cultural districts. So one recent notable policy success was actually adopted in August of 2015, which is the adoption of an artisan manufacturing zoning amendment. Following the adoption of the comp plan, Metro Arts worked with the zoning staff to prepare what they called an artisan manufacturing zoning amendment, which was adopted by the Metropolitan Planning Commission. The amendment created clearer categories for arts and culture related uses and removed some barriers and special permanent requirements for artisan and small micro businesses. The amendment included the creation of new use definitions for artisan manufacturing and allowing this use with conditions in most mixed-use, commercial, and industrial zoned areas of Nashville-Davidson County. It also included the clarification of existing definitions for rehearsal hall, theater, commercial amusement, indoor, and cultural center and other designations as allowable with conditions within artisan manufacturing. It also adjusted the allowances for parking for arts uses and also included new allowances for multifamily live-work housing within the artisan manufacturing zones, such as a maximum of 2 live-work units on the same industrial parcel with exceptions around storage to protect health and safety. There were a lot of conditions that were in play to ensure that this partnership could happen, and this includes Metro Arts' proactive work with other government departments. They often are called upon to partner with government staff to help increase awareness of the needs of different arts uses. Cole and her team, Jennifer Cole being the executive director, often acts as an internal consultant to other colleagues and departments that seek expertise in arts and culture issues. And the Metro Arts staff also understand the terminology in the arts and planning fields, and they're able to act as educators and translators to increase the knowledge base of zoning staff and to also help artists articulate their needs to government and to navigate the permitting process.
Oh, sorry.
Cole sees this provision of expertise as generating better policy in regards to arts and culture with a focus on ensuring that emerging uses fit into current zoning and finding ways to streamline permitting to enable more public art experiences to happen. And here's another case study from San Francisco on art and design. The San Francisco Planning Department's Urban Design Group established a prototyping competition to invite public ideas for interventions that would make Market Street, San Francisco's main thoroughfare, a more vibrant, active, inviting, and enjoyable place to be. So this has been a 5-year effort led by the Department of Public Works involving multiple city agencies in the improvement and enhancement of Market Street. Surveying they've done indicates that placemaking is identified as a high priority, which the city defines as a planning and design strategy that draws inspiration from the local community to create public spaces that promote health, happiness, public engagement, and well-being. The city adapted a street life zone within the existing sidewalk that intends to strengthen the street as a destination. So there have been 2 rounds of prototyping in 2015 and 2016 that have created a range of really wonderful art and design and participatory placemaking type projects, some of which are pictured here. And the successes have included temporary activation of areas along Market Street through these temporary prototypes, an increase in the city design group's competencies with integrating creative placemaking into planning. Prior to this project, the city design group had experience working directly with artists and designers on a temporary urbanism project to implement parklets. This has also increased the city design group's relationships with artists and designers in the community and has increased their competencies in collaborating with nonprofits, a local nonprofit arts organization, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. And they also have developed a clearer understanding of the permitting barriers in place that may inhibit creative placemaking projects to happen, providing space for education and coordination with other agencies. So as of several weeks ago, I learned that the Land Use Committee of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors approved new legislation under review called Places for People that aims to make it faster, cheaper, more transparent, and more accessible to do this type of creative placemaking. This legislation comes before the full Board of Supervisors in November, and if it passes, it will go into effect as early as January. So it's clear that this prototyping demonstration work is influencing city policy, and the hope is that it can permanently shift the culture of planning within the city to infuse innovation and creativity. So through some of the case studies I just talked about, and Julie is going to actually do a deeper dive into cultural planning, these are some of the things that I've heard from the folks I've interviewed. For planning to create the space to do more of this type of work and to partner with the creative community requires cultivating openness, flexibility, and risk tolerance, a willingness to learn from artists' perspectives and methods, being open to a cultural shift in how we do our outreach and engagement, recognizing that art opens conversations in different ways. It can shift perspectives about appropriate ways in which to engage the public. And for planners to be ready to act as translators, to learn the language of the arts and culture sector and work with artists to help them unpack and understand planning issues and concepts. So now I'll turn it over to Julie.
Thanks so much, Jen. I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into 2 case studies of cultural plans that I headed up. One for the City of Boston, which was just issued in June of 2016, and another cultural plan that I headed up for the City of Chicago, which was issued in October of 2012 and has actually undergone implementation over the past 4 years. I really like to think of cultural plans as a way to support the creative ecosystem of a city. And while the needs of the creative sector are different in every city, there's a similar process you might undergo in understanding what those needs are and really working on a strategy for helping to pull together partners and resources to address those needs and to have the city thrive educationally, economically, socially, because it has a thriving cultural sector. So all of this begins with leadership. The reason why Boston undertook a cultural planning process is because Mayor Martin Walsh promised it as an election campaign promise. And similarly in Chicago, the then new mayor, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, promised to do a new cultural plan as part of his administration. So as in any kind of planning process, there's no substitute for leadership, and especially for political leadership. I also think it's important for planning to be informed by values. And in our case, when I walked in the door in City Hall in Boston, found this tacked up on the wall, that the values for cultural planning were very early on articulated quite clearly. And in City Hall there was a lot of ribbing each other about one of them on here, fun, And I think sometimes in the planning world we forget that planning should be fun, and especially if you're talking about arts and culture and artists, you can't leave out the fun. In Chicago, the cultural plan, the context for cultural plan actually built upon several prior plans. In 2012, we were very much inspired by an earlier Chicago cultural plan from 1986. And in the process of creating the plan, we also found an even earlier plan from 1966. So there was the context for planning of a city government caring deeply about the health and welfare of the city through arts and culture for many, many, many decades. Very different context in Boston, where we had never had a cultural plan before, and actually in the prior administration really saw decades of extremely minimal funding and very little municipal support for arts and culture. So obviously the context is going to differ widely and really does greatly inform the planning process. Cultural plans are typically done with a very engaged community process. I'll talk in depth about the process for both plans. This is an infographic that summarized the community engagement process for the plan. It involved several large town hall meetings, both at the beginning and sort of at the end of the public process, smaller, deeper dives in a neighborhood context, and then also discipline-specific convenings, focus groups, briefings to stakeholder groups. The timeline shows sort of what the whole planning process looked like, with a kind of check-in midway with a draft cultural plan, which got very granular feedback and revision before a final cultural plan was issued. At the time, we also made great use of what was then very new to us in terms of digital engagement. So I joined Twitter in the fall of 2011 to prepare for the cultural planning process that kicked off in early 2012. And we really made great use of digital platforms to engage many more people than we would have been able to in just an in-person process. Today that seems obvious and a matter of course, but at the time it was for us something really quite new. We also saw that making the plan available digitally enhanced our ability to reach people quickly so that we can get feedback in a quick turnaround on that draft cultural plan. This is a summary of the engagement process for Boston Creates, the Boston Cultural Plan, and we had a little bit of a different approach, especially with regards to the neighborhood engagement. Instead of planning all of the community meetings ourselves, what we did was cultivate a cohort, recruit a group of volunteers who led community-based teams. So we formed 16 teams that were based in a geographic neighborhood, and then trained 2 to 3 people as co-chairs of that team. We trained them in community engagement and creative engagement, and then supported their effort to convene the neighborhood in ways and places that they best saw fit. So for example, the photo beneath this image is actually at a farmer's market in a neighborhood called Roslindale. Every Saturday there's a farmer's market, and this is the hub of the community. So every Saturday they set up a booth and a tent and engage the community in the conversation right there at the farmer's market. So the teams were allowed to convene the neighborhood as often and where they saw fit, with some guidance from our planning consulting team. So for example, every neighborhood had a meeting simultaneously all over the city on August 1st, and we sort of promoted it as a citywide conversation on the role of arts and culture in the city of Boston. We felt like this distributed approach to engagement was particularly relevant for Boston, where people very strongly identify with their neighborhood and often don't fluidly travel from neighborhood to take part in the cultural life of the city. Things are very siloed geographically in neighborhoods. We also had a pretty extensive governance structure. We had a steering committee of closely held stakeholders, half within city government and half cultural leaders, who actually had been meeting for about a year before I came on board as Chief of Arts and Culture. The Leadership Council was a much larger group, providing a bigger picture oversight, and included people from other sectors and arts funders. This slide just illustrates how people engaged. We always wanted youth, meaning kind of high school age and younger. We wanted them to be involved in all of the community teams in each different neighborhood, but youth told us that they wanted to do that but also have their own team, because they felt that they could have more authentic conversations talking peer to peer rather than feeling intimidated in larger groups where it was dominated by grown-ups. So when there was an authentic kind of desire to engage in a new way, we were nimble and accommodated that inclination. In addition to the qualitative information gathered in community settings, we also fielded an original survey so that we could also have some quantitative information about how people in Boston engaged in creative expression. And the name Boston Creates very much acknowledges the fact that in addition to artists who engage in a serious creative practice over the course of a life, sometimes at like a very high professional level, that most people also engage in some form of creativity, whether they think of themselves as a creative person or not. So in Boston, many people sing in a chorus or a choir. They don't think of themselves as an artist or even a creative person, but creative practice is actually deeply important to their lives. So we were meaning to tease out what that looked like for the people of Boston by fielding this original survey. We also had, as part of our very multifaceted team of consultants working on the cultural plan, a team of artists called the Department of Play. And this is an artist collective who are often involved in civic work and really thinking in creative ways how to engage people, how to leverage the creative approaches of artists to really extend the reach of how the city is talking about a civic issue. They turned around and engaged 3 more artist ethnographers to be embedded in the cultural plan process and to do art making as part of it, but then also to help think about the best way to engage creative people. And one of those artists, Chapon Liu, actually planned a series of bread making sessions for artists so that they would be engaged in a physical act of creativity, which then loosened up their ability to articulate authentically what some of their more thorny challenges are in a sort of trusted, comfortable, homey setting. So really different ways of engaging people in this authentic discussion about the role of culture in their lives. So what did we learn in this process? We learned a lot about silos, and silos between neighborhoods geographically, silos between arts disciplines, big gulfs of understanding between the arts sector and other sectors like healthcare and environment and affordable housing and community development, and big silos between actually different ethnicities, different people from different backgrounds, people from different incomes. And also very closely related to those silos were multifaceted barriers that really prevented people from more deeply engaging in the cultural life of the city. So these also varied tremendously with population. So youth have very different barriers to engagement than the elderly or millennials or people with young children. People with disabilities encounter not only those physical barriers related to Americans for Disabilities, but we found that actually artists with disabilities often face tremendous challenges for just engaging in their creative practice. So this is just a little bit of a summary of what those barriers to engagement look like. So we learned that we really need to expand opportunity to engage in arts and culture, opportunities that are more equitably distributed geographically and among different populations. In Boston, there's an acute need for cultural spaces, artist live work housing, rehearsal space, and even organizations who do have regular access to a facility or have a facility are finding the sustainability of those spaces are enormously challenging. So we know that artists and arts organizations in Boston have been serially gentrified out of many different neighborhoods over the past several decades and are just enormously squeezed. And we also heard a lot from youth and providers of youth arts education, both in school and out of school, that even though we've made tremendous progress with bringing arts education back into the public school system, there's still a great desire for creative youth development opportunities that are innovative, that respond to the needs of youth, and that are actually more broadly available in out-of-school time. We also heard a lot from people about how even though there's so much information available to people on the web and on the internet, but there's still a lot of confusion with figuring out what's going on in time for them to take advantage of it. So how do you cut across all that information that's available to people? And then in Boston, we also heard a tremendous about the challenges for funding, both for nonprofits, large, mid-size, and small, and especially for individual artists who rarely have the ability to access the dollars that are available in the cultural sector. In Boston, funding for the arts is predominantly provided by individual philanthropy. There's a real scarcity of institutional foundation giving and a very modest amount of public funding for arts and culture. So our cultural plan summarizes all of this challenges and opportunities into a series of goals, 5 goals. And they really are meant to address what's the aspiration for Boston, and these goals are then further populated by strategies. So that's what you'll see on this slide to the right are the strategies that are meant to address the goals. And then in the full cultural plan, which is available on the web, you can read a little bit more about what are the tactics we've devised for actually achieving all these different strategies that roll up into these goals. So I won't read through all of them, but I will say that the goal of having a fertile ground for a vibrant arts and culture ecosystem is really meant to create the conditions for new work to happen, for sustainable spaces to be very plentiful and available to the cultural sector, and to have municipal policies that better support creative expression. And this is really removing those barriers that people encounter within City Hall, permitting, licenses, sometimes taxation, sometimes just the operating hours of certain municipal buildings are an impediment to the cultural sector. Goal number 2 is about keeping artists in Boston. Boston does a tremendous job of attracting young people who come here to our very large number of colleges and universities, it does not such a great job of keeping creative people in Boston. So one of the things we're doing is starting to make grants to individual artists. It's something that city government had not been doing before. Another way that we're making municipal government more accessible to the cultural sector is to have a dedicated artist resource person in the staff of the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture who can cut through the confusing array of programs and policies and just make government a little bit more user-friendly and responsive to artists, entrepreneurs, and nonprofit organizations. And then the other thing to address is affordable housing, live-work units, and workspace for artists. I mentioned that artists have been gentrified out of many different neighborhoods, and there's an acute housing shortage in Boston, even more acute shortage of affordable housing, and then an even more critical shortage of spaces that really address the needs of artists of all different genres. Goal number 3 is about cultural equity and accessibility. And how do we create a city where all the different diverse, incredible cultural expressions of a really diverse population are equitably resourced and really visible and accessible to everyone. And I mean accessible in every single sense of that word, both physically and sort of philosophically or culturally relevant. We have a lot of disparities between underserved neighborhoods, and if you walk around the city of Boston, you don't really see or hear expressed all the different stories of all of our different populations. You sort of hear repeated again and again one narrative of colonial revolutionary Boston. You don't really hear that much about other cultures that were perhaps here before then or sort of flourished after that. And how can we actually leverage culture as a way to have civic dialogue about other issues that are plaguing us, whether they are income inequality or racial divides or climate change. Goal number 4 is about integrating arts and culture into all aspects of civic life. It's a very broad aspirational goal, and we're really here talking about how the city does its day-to-day business. How do we weave arts and culture into the public realm and think very deliberately about our design of the city and design of civic spaces and design of public buildings so that we can be inclusive of not only public art but cultural uses and artists? How do we make Boston a place where arts education, not only to young people but to seniors, people at all stages of their lives? And then, of course, how do we make the city more receptive to new ideas and incorporate creative ideas into city government so that we can do our work in the most innovative possible way? Goal number 5 is really about mobilizing new partners to work collectively to advance these goals. And we talk about partners likely and unlikely. And we really need to work on our advocacy for the arts and culture sector if we're ever going to achieve a more robust public funding climate. And then how do we talk to other sectors about incorporating creative approaches to their thorny issues? We have a very large healthcare sector here in Boston. We're starting to talk about how can arts and culture be part of the toolkit in the recovery community and really looking at our thorny issues of opioid overdose and addiction and recovery. Arts and culture can be an incredible partner in the set of tools we have available for some of these more thorny issues. So how do we bring those partners together and really help them move forward collectively and leverage the tools they need to overcome their challenges? In all of this, it's really important for us to articulate what success looks like when the cultural plan is implemented. What is the result? What's the impact of our work? And then, of course, the challenge is how to measure it. It's one of the reasons we did a survey at the beginning, was to really understand how creatively engaged are our populations, and then maybe we can measure some of those changes moving forward. Having a really strong pool of artists and creative entrepreneurs is enormously important for innovation, economy, and the overall economic health of our city. Intimately tied to that strong pool of artists and entrepreneurs is having a really active marketplace for arts and culture. Sustainability is enormously important, and then having the support of municipal policies and goals really helps to weave together the funding and the marketplace and the sustainability. And then, of course, really making active use of the arts to think in new ways about all of the civic problems that the city might be facing. And all of this because the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture was actually very small and is growing. We're thinking very carefully about what is the role of city government. Does the city lead an initiative? Is the city along as a partner, whether it's the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture or perhaps the Office of Recovery or the Office of Women's Advancements or the Mayor's Office for Disabilities? And then how can the city act actually as a catalyst for external partners who maybe are going to coalesce and move forward on their own steam with the city as a sort of a minor player in that effort. And so what we're looking for in these partnerships is to really maximize our efforts to be collaborative so that we can have collective impact. And then in all of this, of course, a big part of implementation is really understanding how to prioritize all of this work. So you'll see in the full cultural plan, every strategy and tactic is given an estimate of how long it will take. Some things are shorter, nearer term. Some things might take many, many years to put into play. As planners, you can certainly understand some of these things are multi-year efforts. And this is just a quick look at our first several months of implementation. We have partnered with an organization to make grants to artists to grow their business capacity so that they have the assets to actually invest in their careers. We're adding an artist resource staff person to kind of centralize the information that's available to creative entrepreneurs. We've started making grants to individual artists in an almost monthly opportunity fund. And these are kind of micro grants at the sort of $1,000 to $500 level. We are bringing artists in residence within city government to rethink how we do our work in the most creative and innovative ways possible. The Artists in Residence program this year is focused on our community centers and really thinking about how do we engage communities in new creative ways, how do we serve communities through our community centers, and then how can those community centers be reinvigorated by having an artist in residence in the spaces. The Arts Ed policy, which is really a model nationwide, is about 15 years old and is ready for an update to reflect the goals that we heard in our public process. And then in kind of a more fun vein, the City of Boston was actually granted a low power FM station. So how can we use this platform to get the word out about what's happening in Creative Boston and sort of lift up some of those hidden gems in our cultural sector. Another thing we're doing is creating a Percent for Art program within city government. Many of you are probably familiar with this. It exists at the federal level in about 26 different states and hundreds of municipalities, where a small percentage of a capital construction budget for municipal buildings will be allocated specifically for art tied to that municipal construction project. And actually some of the case studies that Jen mentioned earlier are the product of Percent for Art programs. So we're starting to incorporate artwork into public works projects that are addressing like the rebuilding of an intersection, and then incorporating public art into public buildings such as libraries and schools. We hope that we can model the behavior we'd like to see in the private sector, but we won't be legislating at this point that private development be mandated to include arts and culture as part of their capital plans, although we certainly hope to see that happen. In the works is a study, a deeper dive into just exactly what is the need for cultural facilities in the city, and these are performing spaces and rehearsal spaces. We do have mandated cultural spaces built in private development in certain waterfront buildings. It's called Chapter 91. And our planning agency, which has actually been renamed, the Boston Redevelopment Authority was recently renamed the Boston Planning and Development Agency, will be putting those cultural spaces out to bid. In the future, we'll be really looking closely at cultural equity. What are the barriers to cultural equity? There's a growing field of practice in the cultural sector on understanding the barriers of cultural equity, and then what are the tools that municipal government can bring to bear to appreciably move the needle in this work. We're partnering with our Office of Financial Empowerment to partner with some of the colleges and universities to understand how do we grow a pipeline of young people for the creative industries. These are young people who are maybe not necessarily bound for four-year university or college programs. How do we help pipeline them into really great careers in the creative industries where you just need training and you don't need a four-year degree? One of the most exciting things we're doing is looking at much more specifically the need for artist spaces, whether they're affordable housing, live work, or just workspaces, and then how do we incorporate them into development, either development that's led by the city, such as the redevelopment of our public housing, or into private development. We're really excited that the Boston Housing Authority, which oversees public housing, when they redevelop public housing, and by redevelop I mean densify public housing developments to have additional units and to have mixed income units, they'll be looking at how those new units can accommodate set-asides for artist housing who do qualify for public housing or who also would qualify for affordable housing. So we're looking actually very holistically at how do we bring cultural uses and artists into sort of newly mixed income public housing developments. In Chicago, we've had the benefit of seeing implementation over a number of years. I mentioned earlier that the plan was a very different context of having sort of successive waves of cultural planning and a little bit of a different approach in terms of how we categorized the goals and strategies and initiatives and tactics. Much bigger city than Boston, and it was 10 key priorities that fell roughly into 4 categories. Things that address people, places, municipal policies, and what we called planning culturally was really just approaching the planning of things from a new perspective, a very collaborative perspective that incorporated arts and culture thinking from the beginning. You'll see that number 1 is foster arts education and lifelong learning, and that is primarily because in the public engagement process in Chicago, the number 1 priority that emerged was to have arts education equitably in the public school system. It was such an overwhelming public mandate during the process that the staff of the Chicago Public Schools Arts Education Office saw this as a great opportunity to coalesce their partners around this public mandate and create the first ever arts education plan for the public schools. So they actually ran alongside the cultural plan process, and by the time we issued the cultural plan, they issued an abstract and then a framework for moving forward with an arts education plan for the public schools. One of the really interesting things they did, this is just an infographic that starts to summarize early stage implementation of the cultural plan, basically at the first year milestone of implementation. Just the sheer act of starting to understand how much arts education is happening in the schools, how many minutes, how many genres, which grades, which partners were doing arts in the schools, helped them understand how divergent access to arts education was in the schools, and then how could they start to build a system for basically saying you need to move up this ladder of incorporating arts education in the school, and then tying funding to gathering that data and then moving up the ladder of equitable access to arts in the schools. And again, one of the really successful implementation items in Chicago was bringing cultural programs to the many parks and park district facilities. And this is just a summary of some of those achievements as a result of the Chicago Cultural Plan. So as I mentioned, the Arts Education Plan was created, and then the Creative Schools was funded to help implement that Arts Education Plan. Night Out in the Parks is the name of the program that really sought to bring external arts and culture organizations into parks, primarily as a public safety initiative, so that they would crowd out negative and bad activities that was happening in the parks with really positive family-friendly activities to just boost the overall utilization and safety of parks. Incentivate was a grant program really focused on large-scale public participatory arts programs happening all throughout the city. And one of the most successful initiatives of the cultural plan was the launch of the first ever Chicago Architecture Biennial, which launched about a year ago and was enormously successful. This is just a little bit of a teaser graphic. If you're interested in following a cultural planning process from beginning to end, New York City has just a week ago kicked off their cultural planning process, and it will wrap up in June of 2017. So it's a great opportunity to follow along and see how is New York City looking at their public engagement process, what's their sort of multifaceted way for reaching on a really large scale in 5 different boroughs, both in person and digitally. How will they go about doing that? And I think what's really interesting is the scale of New York is so specific. In particular, they already do so much and already are considered the arts and culture capital of the U.S. That what are the things that they address in a cultural plan moving forward? And you'll see some of the issues have been articulated up front: cultural, equal access to arts and culture, affordability for artists, some coordination of partners, arts education. So some of the same issues you'll hear again and again and again, but how they go about articulating the issues and then coming up with programs to implement them will be entirely different because the context is so different. And with that, I think we're ready to open things up for questions, and what we'll do is Jen just switch to a screen that has our contact information on it, because I know that we've been going through this stuff very, very quickly, and I'm sure all of you will have a tremendous number of follow-up questions. We're happy to field Anything we don't get to in this Q&A, we're happy to field separately. So I think Ben is the one who's going to be moderating the Q&A.
I am indeed, and here I am. This has been a terrific presentation. I've got a ton of questions myself, but I do want to get to the questions that we have from our attendees and encourage people who are online right now to start putting in more questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in the next 25 minutes. I want to start off with, one of the questions is of a political nature, and I'm not going to ask you to answer this question, but I do want you to think about it. And the question is, this is from Janie, do you think that the outcome of the election in 4 days, oh thank God it's only 4 days now, will impact the integration of art into planning? Now, Julie, you talked a lot about the importance of leadership from Mayors Walsh and Emanuel in Boston and Chicago, respectively. And
yes.
you kind of tried to flesh out what is the role of political leadership in the arts and planning.
Yeah, I think all politics is local, as they say. And if you really look at how much federal funding and how much federal cultural policy impacts the local, it's really very minor. We were lucky to get some NEA support and Americans for the Arts support for our work. And more money is always welcome, but if you really look at the local level, how much funding from the federal government is really hitting smaller municipalities, it's pretty minor. And that's both good and bad. I think there's the opportunity on the local level to advocate really strongly locally on the role of arts and culture in your municipality. And then the great thing is that arts and culture can be funded in many, many different ways. So there's municipal funding, and I think leveraging all the different municipal budgets is a really smart way to go about it. And they're doing the same thing in the federal government. They're doing the same thing in New York City. So, the school's budget is enormous. The seniors' budget is enormous. The library budget. So if we think really strategically about how to leverage other allied sectors' budgets, you start to see like, oh, it could be very multifaceted. But the other thing is there's private philanthropy, and then individuals are, crowdfunding is this whole new source of support where I just think that the role of the federal government in the U.S. and all of this is really pretty modest. So I don't know that the election is going to really change things.
I agree with that. The National Endowment for the Arts actually put out this report called How the U.S. Funds the Arts. It came out several years ago, and it's a really great primer on how governments raise the funds locally and nationally for arts and culture. So if you look at that, they actually say that even with shifting political parties in the administration, at the federal level, it hasn't really meant like any major changes in terms of the money. So what's really important, as Julie said, is the local advocacy and being creative about finding ways to find the money for this type of work in various departments. So one of the questions and opportunities for planning and community development departments is to think about, what are some of those really tough planning goals and objectives that you're trying to move, and could a partnership with the creative community or your local cultural council or your state arts agency add value? Like, is there a way you can leverage some of those resources and connections to integrate and tap into some of those resources and those people to partner with them?
I suppose it does matter what the size is of the municipality. So, for example, here in New Hampshire, our state capital is Concord. It's a city of about 40,000 people. It's a very small community, relatively speaking. But they got a Tiger grant to do some significant improvements to their Main Street, kind of a road diet, shifting it down from 4 lanes to 3 and expanding the pedestrian accessibility. But part of that was public art, which is now just being revealed as part of one of the finishing touches of the project. So I think the Tiger grant funding was helpful in that regard, where the city voters might not necessarily have funded that. There was money available from the federal government. But so Julie, you had mentioned in capital projects setting aside a small percentage of the overall project budget, and I think this is really what Concord was doing, for public art. Is there a magic number? What percentage do we need to look at?
Yeah, you know what? I don't think there's a magic number. I think that it really depends on the project, and it depends on the scale. So what you'll find in a lot of percent for our programs is there is a formula, and there is a number, and there is a percentage. But we're actually not going to tie ourselves to a fixed percentage. So for example, the public works projects we're doing now, because the budgets for the projects are really quite small, the amount we're spending on artwork is actually a higher percentage of the budget than you would ever see in a percent for art budget. It's almost 10% of the budget. But for our larger municipal percent for art budget, it's actually going to be pooled. So it's I think 1% of the total capital borrowing we'll do in any given year. It's a pool of money that then we allocate to projects. So we're not taking any money away from the budget of any one project, but we're actually enhancing that project with a little bit of money from sort of the pool. So that's the approach we're taking. And I think it's worth looking at percent for art ordinances. I know APA has an incredible library of model ordinances.
Oh, the Americans for the Arts, actually.
And Americans for the Arts as well. There's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. I'm a big fan of pooled funding for percent for art, because what we found, for example, in Chicago was that it was one project, one budget, and I believe that the formula there has changed over time. It was like 1.33% of hard costs, and then maybe it went up to 2%. But even with that percentage, you'd have smaller renovation projects that yielded a very small art budget. You really couldn't do much with it, other than maybe purchase some artwork, which isn't really the intent of percent for art, in my opinion. In my opinion, it's meant to be thinking about the design of the public realm and the design of civic structures in a way that really embeds the art in the design of the building. And that's only really possible for larger projects or projects over a certain budget size or sort of over a certain scale of renovation.
So sticking with the money topic, we have a question from Richard. Did any of the communities you worked with have a public art tax to help fund installation of such art? And he's not. I queried him, and he's not specific on what type of tax, whether sales tax or income tax, any tax. Do any communities? None that you know of.
Yeah, I think what you'll see is there are a lot of different taxes out there that fund arts and culture more broadly, some of which might fund public art. So if you look at Cuyahoga County in Ohio, which is basically Cleveland, they've got a cigarette tax that funds a lot of grant making to arts and culture. I don't know that the money goes to municipal public art, but I think it goes to public art a little bit more broadly. It definitely goes to organizations and artists. You'll see that the Denver has the Arts and Sciences District, which raises like $85 million a year. And that goes to a whole variety. So there's a number of taxes out there. Typically you'll see hotel motel taxes or convention and visitor bureau type like car rental taxes or sugary soda taxes that fund arts and culture. But I don't know off the top of my head if any of them are specifically focused on public art.
They're the National Association of State Arts Agencies. They're the membership organization for all the state arts agencies in the country. They have some great briefing documents on their website that I believe I linked to in the toolkit, where they've done this research to document the types of taxes and fees that different communities across the country are using to generate funds for public art. I also did some research into this in my thesis. It's not fresh in the top of my mind at this moment, but I may lift some of that into the toolkit as well, some of those examples of communities that are using these other mechanisms.
Great, thanks. And we have a question from Marcia regarding the New York City cultural plan that's ongoing. Do you know where the funding came from for that?
Yeah, some of it is from, I'm just trying to remember, hopefully it'll say on their website, but I think they might have some pooled funding from philanthropy. So this is several foundations who've pooled together, and I believe it's called the New York Fund for a Cultural Future, something like that. So it's pretty typical that funding for a cultural plan would come from philanthropy. But their plan was mandated by city council ordinance, so it might have been partially funded by the city.
Interesting. We have a question here from Kathleen. Could you discuss how you are collaborating with and including statewide arts and humanities councils?
Yeah, sure. In Boston, in Massachusetts, we have the Massachusetts Cultural Council. They were part of Jen's working group for the Arts and Culture Toolkit. We have an incredibly well-organized and robust cultural council in Massachusetts, and so we work with them all the time. They are a funder of my department, especially with our grant making. And they're also a big partner in cultural districts and creative youth development. So they're really deeply engaged in the cultural ecosystem of Boston, I would say. They also, Mass Cultural Council also administers a capital fund for cultural facilities fund. It's statewide. It's about $10 million a year.
There's some information on it in our toolkit.
And yeah, it's in the toolkit. Yeah. It's a great model, and they leverage funding from Mass Development, which is a large statewide development agency. I would say that's a great model to replicate. So we actually have a really great relationship with our state arts council in Massachusetts. The Illinois Arts Council, we did also in Chicago work closely with them. Again, they were a funder of the local arts council, the local department, and they actually partially supported the cultural plan, especially the engagement with artists. So I would say that they're they really differ widely among states. Sometimes they're just pass-through agencies. Sometimes they're deeply involved programmatically. I think it really depends. Yeah.
Right now, MAPC is also working on a local cultural planning process with the town, and the local cultural council gives away, I think it's definitely under $20,000 a year. So it's not a lot of money, and all those folks are volunteers, but we're working to engage them in our local cultural planning process. And I anticipate that one of the things we'll work into our Arts and Culture Action Plan that we're developing for them is finding ways to align the resources of the local cultural council and the talents of the folks who serve on that council to partner on the implementation of the cultural plan, and perhaps find ways to augment some of their funds with the funds of the Planning and Community Development Department, of which this cultural planning project will be stewarded through.
Jen, you just mentioned that you're working in a smaller community, and I'm thinking about this a lot because so many planners work in small municipalities. And they may be, essentially solo shops, the only game in town for planning. So, what kind of message do you have for those communities where, and I'm thinking my own town. I mentioned Concord, New Hampshire. It's 40,000. I live in a town that's 2,800 people, which is really small. We don't have professional planning staff, and yet we have a really strong arts culture. It's one of the things that attracted my wife and me to that town. What kind of message do you have for really small towns that have very limited financial resources and may not have any personnel to devote to this?
Right, I know that reality really well. So at MAPC, we serve 101 cities and towns, and many of our communities don't have planners. So I definitely understand that pressure. So I would say, start with your partnerships. There are lots of arts organizations in each city or town, and they have a lot of philanthropic resources. Not a lot, but if pooled together and leveraged, those funds could go a long way. I say that that's really important in an area for growth because the Americans for the Arts Conference, Boston actually just hosted it back in June of this year. So AFTA is sort of the national organization for arts advocates. It pulls in people from arts organizations, cultural councils, and Julie and I were only among a handful of planners who were at that conference, but from the people I spoke to and met, there's definitely this appetite and interest to partner with planning and community development and to find ways to sort of align around shared goals. And there are many. I mean, I think when we start talking about livability, like arts and culture organizations, they get that. I mean, they're doing that through their public art work and through their education work. So I would say start with getting a sense of your cultural assets in your community. And oftentimes the state arts agencies will be available to help with that. And there's a section in the toolkit on cultural asset mapping. If you were to do sort of a light process to sort of map who your assets are, the people in the organizations, that would be a great place to start. There are the regional planning commissions and agencies and MPOs such as MAPC. So we are actually, for this community of 40,000, we are funding the cultural planning process. And we find those resources through different avenues. One avenue is through our annual advocacy to our legislature to get money for the regional planning agencies in our state to do technical assistance work. We also have assessment that we get from cities and towns based on population, so that's money we re-grant and we use to fund our TA work. We also actively apply for grants on behalf of our communities as the regional planning agency. So we work very hard through the technical assistance program to raise the money through different sources to fund the work that we know our communities want. So I would say go to your regional planning agency or your commission or your MPO and figure out if they can find some resources to help you do some of that work.
Yeah, and another resource that planners should be aware of are their regional NEA affiliates, National Endowment for the Arts affiliates. So here in New England, we have the New England Foundation for the Arts, NEFA, and they serve 7 states in New England. So they serve Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, which are not that densely populated and are looking to bring arts resources sort of from around the region to them. And so the regional NEA affiliates are an incredible resource for connecting you with ideas, resources, partners. One of the things NEFA does is they help artists to go on tour throughout the region and bring arts and culture to parts of New England that sort of would never be on the radar of larger, more commercial touring arts entities. And they have funding, they have a tremendous amount of expertise, and every single part of the U.S. is covered by one of 9 NEA regional affiliates.
Okay, we have a comment here along these lines from Jackie, and she works in Chautauqua County, New York, and she says that they're currently working on an arts, culture, and heritage plan with outside consultants, and they got a CFA grant from New York State. I'm not sure what CFA stands for. But she just pointing out that there are resources available at the state level, which may be of significant help. I'm sorry, she said Cattaraugus County. I do want to switch gears a little bit. Julie, when you were talking about the cultural planning process in Boston, you talked about the voice of youth and how they wanted to have their own group. Which I think is great and wonderful. My question then is, how did you then take the results of their work and integrate it into the broader plan?
Yeah, something I didn't mention was we had a system for gathering the information from every community meeting. There was a template for note-taking and feedback that then you submitted and got aggregated into our sort of synthesis of all the community engagement. So there might have been an adult there or someone from our team there, but to doing the notes and sort of gathering up information. So we did have a system for sort of synthesis.
Okay, great. In both Boston and in Chicago and certainly also in New York City, there's this notion of gentrification going on. My son lives in Brooklyn, and he sees it happening on a street-by-street basis. And here in New Hampshire, smaller state, the same thing is happening in the city of Portsmouth, a city of about 20,000 people, which is really is known as an arts community, but artists can no longer afford to live there. In addition to, say, housing for artists, what other suggestions might you have to make places more affordable for artists?
Yeah, I'm a big believer that the tools of ownership in the hands of the worker is incredibly powerful. And so what we're trying to do is help people understand that the only way to not, well, one of the most powerful ways to not get gentrified is to own your real estate. And I know that this isn't necessarily an option for everyone, but there are a tremendous number of programs, home buyer assistance programs, that often creative people are not plugged into. They're not aware of it. They don't take advantage of it. And these are existing tools that every city has. Whether it's wanting to keep people or wanting to prevent gentrification. So I think leveraging tools that exist are really important, but also advocating that tools that don't necessarily apply can apply. So for example, our Cultural Facilities Fund here in Boston is not applicable to artist live work housing or artist workspaces, and actually it wouldn't be a bad idea for us to work on some legislative or administrative changes to make that tool applicable to this situation. So I think looking at the tools that you have and really maximizing them will go a long way. But it's true that there are other programs. There's one in San Francisco. It's called CAST, and it was created, and I believe it's Community Asset Stabilization Trust, or it might be Cultural Asset Stabilization Trust, and it was specifically created to help small and mid-sized arts organizations who were renting their spaces to be in a position to buy their spaces and then sort of prevent themselves from being gentrified out of those spaces. And it was a city initiative launched by the City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with philanthropy. And these are smaller projects. In San Francisco, you can imagine that the development pressure is acute. But these are smaller projects on the scale of, a capital project that might be $1 million or $2 million or $3 million, not like $50 million projects, but sort of smaller scale. And in an even smaller municipality where the scale and the cost might be lower, you might be able to leverage some development funds. I really think ownership is the most important way to prevent displacement.
And the value of having planners aware of the needs of this sector is what creates the space for us to think about what can we do to mitigate displacement of the creative community when we're doing comprehensive planning focused on, for example, housing development. So in Massachusetts, we're working with communities to do housing production plans, and we're looking at the full package of what we can do to help communities think about mitigating displacement, or what we also refer to as managing neighborhood change. So, there's a way for us to think in a more nuanced way as planners. What are the needs of the different segments of the community, of the creative economy, and how can we make sure that segment of the community is activated to participate in the civic process and to advocate for inclusionary zoning, or to advocate for preservation or redevelopment of properties that could be prime for artist workspace or live workspace. So it's also incumbent on the arts community to get involved civically, but it's also about how can planners be more conscious of that segment of our community and be sure that we're thinking about their needs as we're doing planning work.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I know that there's a challenge of resources and scale, and I want to also emphasize for planners, and especially municipal planners, that sometimes getting city government in a position to just say yes actually is incredibly powerful in terms of allowing creative things to happen. Just having city government get out of the way of creative entrepreneurship could go a really long way, and a lot of times things can flourish without having to do a tremendous amount of funding, but just remove those barriers, remove those impediments.
And as it is now the end, we're going to let that be the last word. So I want to thank Julie and Jen for this really illuminating presentation. It's been fun for me. For anyone who is seeking to log their CM credits, remember to log into your APA account, and you can search for event number 9112776, and this is good for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. And again, this is Ben Frost from the Planning Webcast Consortium, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.